Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are logging in from. My name is Margarita Mooney Suarez. I am the founder and executive director of Scala Foundation, the host of tonight's webinar with the Honorable Dan Lipinski. Before I introduce our guest, I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight for this topic, where we're going to talk with the Honorable Dan Lipinski about his journey from a blue-collar background in Chicago to the United States House of Representatives, and hear his views on education, politics, and faith in contemporary America. This class is part of this webinar tonight, is part of a class I'm co-teaching that I'm teaching with the Pepperdine School of Public Policy. The class is entitled Humanizing Education Policy. The goal of the class is to examine the foundational ideas that have shaped educational practice in the United States, and to look at the interplay between how we think about what it means to be human with what we understand to be the purpose of education. And tonight's talk is incredibly exciting, tonight's dialogue, because it helps us get at the heart of what we're talking about here, the relationship between education and democracy. Scala's mission is to restore culture by renewing the liberal arts tradition of education with an emphasis on beauty and wisdom. I started Scala 5 years ago because I was concerned that educational institutions often didn't know how to frame their mission around meaning and purpose. And I was concerned that there was a loss of an understanding of the vertical dimension of the human person, our desires for transcendence and beauty, and that much of education was being framed purely, almost exclusively, in practical terms, whether that be scientific or practical in terms of social justice. But human formation, integral human formation, where does this fit into education? So tonight I have students from my class joining us, and we have guests, Scala Foundation's subscribers and friends who are interested in these enduring questions around education. Just a reminder about how tonight's format will work. It will be a dialogue between me and the Honorable Dan Lipinski. And if you have questions for us, we will take those at the end. You can use the Q&A button to put in your questions. Now, let me get us started. I would love to introduce my friend now, if I may say, someone I've actually met in person a few times, the first time right before COVID started, and most recently we were together at the Napa Institute meetings in Northern California, actually just a few days ago. So a little shout out to the Napa Institute for a great event. And the Honorable Dan Lipinski, Ph.D., was a member of the United States House of Representatives. He represented the 3rd District of the state of Illinois. He ran as a Democrat, member of the Democratic Party, and he was in the United States House of Representatives from 2005 to 2021. Congressman Lepinsky was known to be not only highly knowledgeable, but an effective lawmaker who worked hard to bring people together across the aisle to solve problems. He authored 20 laws on a wide variety of issues, including laws that boosted American manufacturing, increased research funding for the National Science Foundation, spurred technological innovation, protected the environment, and fought climate change, empowered victims of sexual assault, expanded consumers' rights, and honored veterans. Congressman Lepinsky served on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, where he chaired the subcommittee on rail, pipelines, and hazardous materials, as well as the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, where he chaired and served as ranking member of the Research and Technology subcommittees. After completing his Bachelor's of Science at Northwestern University and a Master's in Science at Stanford University in Engineering, Lipinski went on to earn his Ph.D. in American Politics from Duke University, and he won the American Political Science Association's Carl Albert Dissertation Award for the best dissertation in legislative studies. He authored Congressional Communication, Content, and Consequences through the University of Michigan Press, as well as several articles and book chapters on Congress and the legislative process. Dr. Lipinski currently serves on the advisory council of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and runs Lipinski Solutions, LLC, a consulting company. Since leaving, or since losing his most recent election for Congress, he's had a lot more time to write about his experiences. And I'm delighted to say that I've read wonderful articles by him in the Wall Street Journal, the Chicago Tribune, as well as in Public Discourse. And I'm delighted to have him tonight to share with us his views on education, faith, and politics. Well, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Margarita, and I'm tired of listening to my bio. So,
well, it is great to have you here. Now, if you're tired of listening to your bio, let me just ask you a little bit more about your bio. Specifically, could you tell us a little bit about how you grew up, and specifically, what kind of education did you receive growing up?
Well, I started listening to my bio just because I don't. This wasn't good for a politician, but I didn't like talking about myself and about except in the context of things that I did as a representative for my constituents. But maybe it's because I grew up on the southwest side of Chicago, very middle class neighborhood just west of Midway Airport. Went to our parish, Catholic parish grade school. Where the education was decent. I wouldn't say it was great, but I had the opportunity to go to one of the best Catholic high schools in the city of Chicago, St. Ignatius College Prep, taught by the Jesuits. I often say it wasn't a Catholic school, it was a Jesuit school. But at St. Ignatius, it was just an excellent education. And it also drew students from all across Chicago and its suburbs, which was an education in itself. It was in a neighborhood that was not always the safest neighborhood. I had friends held up at gunpoint. So there were a lot of things that went into the education that I received at St. Ignatius. From there, so I'd say it was I took Latin for 4 years. It was a pretty well-rounded education, and really instilled in me a love of learning to some extent. I still, unfortunately, we were all grade mongers because we were all good students going to the school, and I thought getting good grades was the most important thing. I was deciding what I wanted to do, sort of with my life as I was going to college, trying to choose my major. My father was a member of Congress, and I thought that I would go into politics. My father did not go to college, and I remember talking to him when deciding on my major. I decided to go to Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, just north of Chicago. And I remember him telling me they're not going to teach you anything in school that's going to help you to be a politician. Now, how my father knew that, well, he probably intuited it. He didn't actually go to college, as I said. But I decided, okay, well, I'm not going to major in political science then. I will do something practical, something that my parents aren't just wasting their money on, and I'll get a degree in engineering. I decided to go for mechanical engineering. I was really good at math, and I loved physics in high school, and went for my degree in mechanical engineering. I tried to figure out from there what I wanted to do, and kept all my options open, interviewed for some engineering jobs, decided I didn't want to do that. Thought I was going to go to law school, applied to some law schools, got into a couple of good ones. Applied to one program in something called Engineering Economic Systems at Stanford. I thought, well, I also took a lot of economics as an undergrad. Maybe this is a program I could sort of move. It was still in the School of Engineering, but move into economics. Again, it was all very practical, pragmatic, was my thinking. I, at the last minute, decided I didn't want to go to law school. Went to that program at Stanford. In a year, graduated with my master's in engineering economic systems from Stanford. Worked in Switzerland for Swiss Air as a systems analyst for 6 months. And I came to the decision, though, sometime in at the end of college and through grad school that I wanted to be a professor. I wanted to teach. Part of it was that I respected my professors. I remember going to my sister's law school graduation, how much they respected. There's a professor there who all the students love, received an award, and I thought I'd like to teach. But I didn't want to teach engineering. And I thought, what do I love? I love economics and I love government and politics. People told me you'll be better off getting a PhD in economics because there's more jobs. But I thought I love government and politics. Applied to a number of schools. 2 schools took a chance on me. They were schools that had rational choice theory, which uses economics. Both of those schools, University of Rochester and also Duke, were big in that. And they took a chance on someone who had no poli-sci background. Went to Duke, got my PhD at Duke, spent 2 years working on Capitol Hill with the fellowship, and then went and I taught. At first at University of Notre Dame with a 1-year job and a tenure track job at the University of Tennessee. And through all this, there were many days when I was teaching political science where I thought, I was an engineering undergrad. What am I doing here? And am I actually providing my students with a value in their education? And part of that was just I was still just very practical, pragmatic, and I figure students are spending this time, someone's paying for it, they should be getting a degree they can do something with. Looking back, I wish if I knew where I was going to wind up, I may not have gotten a degree in engineering. I would have liked to have a better background, liberal arts background than I have if I knew I was going to be a professor. Although engineering really did help my thinking process. And as a member of Congress, I'm not sure. A liberal arts education may have been better. That background may have been a little more helpful. But on the other hand, I thought differently than a lot of my colleagues did. And I think a lot of that is I always ask the question, was it my training as an engineer, my education engineer, or did I always think that way in just a very logical sort of manner? And that's how I largely approach decision making. So I'll stop there. It's a long setup of what my educational background and in general what my trajectory for the past 35, 40 years.
Well, that's fascinating. All right. So you had a Jesuit high school education, followed by Northwestern engineering, Stanford engineering, and then a PhD in political science. So it sounds like quite a quantitative kind of approach to political science. So not so much political theory as decision-making, equations, kinds of things, right?
If I can interrupt you there.
Sure.
So at Duke at the time, there was a requirement that everyone in the PhD program, political science, had to take 2 political theory courses. And I really was very unhappy about that because I knew nothing about political theory. I wasn't interested in political theory, but they wound up being 2 of the most, I learned more from those 2 classes than probably from any other class that I took in grad school. I took a modern political theory course, which I was just lost because I had no background. But it really did help me tremendously. And I took American Political Thought class, which I have recently, in writing some articles, I've gone back to I dug out my notes from that class and dug out my copy of the Federalist Papers, which I marked up from that class in Tocqueville's Democracy in America. And I've used, I'm using that now from that class. So, a class that I didn't ever want to take, but was forced to take in political theory was incredibly valuable for me. Although that was All right, theorists will tell me that was political thought, not political theory. So.
Well, okay, well, we don't have to split hairs there, at least not tonight. But what you said, I think, leads me a little bit into the mission of Scala and why I have you here tonight as a dialogue partner, right? That you mentioned, and I think a lot of people think that education should be practical. It should help us to get a job. Therefore, studying mathematics, engineering in college is a good way to go. But you also have said that you feel that in some ways you missed out by not having a liberal arts education, which I understand to be oriented towards passing on a core set of ideas that help us understand the world from a variety of perspectives, as well as passing on the foundational ideas that have shaped the civilization that we live in. One of the characteristics of the civilization we live in is that we live in a democracy that's founded on ideas of individual rights. And so understanding how it is we came to have the form of government that we have, it should be a part of education. And I want to push you a little bit on this because I know you and I have had these conversations and now it's time to sort of share them publicly. But you've told me that on the one hand, you like the idea of liberal arts education, but yet you're afraid that too many young people might waste the opportunity to get a liberal arts education because they're actually more preoccupied with other things. Could you explain a little bit what your hesitations are about liberal arts as a curriculum in college?
Well, as a engineering undergrad, part of it was my jealousy of, Wednesday night was a big frat party night. I was not in a frat, but it was a big party night at Northwestern. And no one in the College of Arts and Sciences had classes on Thursday. Engineers and those who were majoring in sciences had labs on Thursday. And so honestly, that was part of it, the jealousy that I felt like I was working a whole lot harder. But I also thought, well, I'm getting a degree that's going to be worth something when I get out of here. Now, at the age of 55, I would value more the liberal arts education. I think a lot of students look at college, and I hate to say this, but I saw it as a student, I saw it as a assistant professor. A lot of students don't really care about their education when they're college. So they're there to party for 4 years or 5 or 6 years. And they view liberal arts classes, a liberal arts major is being easy. And so they're gonna do that instead. And that's a concern that I have. You can't fudge it. You can't just get by in engineering sciences or math. And I have to say my wife was a math major. So we have that in common. But I just think that if we are in theory, it would be great for everyone to have a good education in the liberal arts and better understand life and the way it really. I've noticed that I sort of go back now. It's after college and that I've picked up along the way a lot more of my liberal arts education, and through reading, through listening to podcasts, et cetera. And it really helps me in terms of the way people look at life. It helps me to take my experiences and what I have gained from my experience and sort of look at, hear from others, how they view. It helps me put those experiences into different perspectives, and to also, I think I could better judge different political theories, for example, after having a lot of experience. And so I think you don't have that. Most young people don't have that. If I had a liberal arts major when I was an undergrad, how serious of a student would I have been? I was a serious student, but how serious would I have been about really getting a lot out of those classes? I would have been serious about getting an A. But I'm not sure. But I just fear a lot of students go to college, have no interest in learning. They have no interest in getting educated, and I've seen that, and I think that that's a problem, and we probably have too many professors who let them get away with that and don't really challenge them and don't really hit them in any way, which for most students it would be with low grades to wake them up and say, you need to take this seriously.
Wow. Well, thanks for sharing that publicly, because I know that it's one of the concerns about liberal arts education that people don't express that often, which sounds to me like you're saying a liberal arts education, it needs to be taken seriously, that topics in philosophy or history or literature are matters of serious study and discussion, but they can and maybe sometimes often are treated in a way that's not challenging, that's not rigorous, perhaps in comparison to what you experienced as an engineering major. But yet I also heard you saying that you wish you had more exposure to the ideas and thinkers and kinds of questioning and deliberation that should happen in the liberal arts ideal, because it is important to our system of governance, which includes deliberation, looking at something from different points of view. So I wanted to ask you now more about, given your political experience, if you could just reflect a little bit on, well, what kind of an education around these liberal arts questions, which I would include in the liberal arts question, kind of what's our fundamental nature as human persons? What constitutes our good? Like, how do we build the common good with other people? What does that actually mean? And how these questions have been debated and looked at from different perspectives, right? So one of the things I know you've told me personally is that you do believe that there is some kind of objective truth, and that one of the goals of education is helping us to see that. Would that be a fair assessment of what you've shared with me?
Well, I'm very conflicted on this, in that, yes, I have no question there's objective truth. And I, as a Catholic, I look to the Catholic Church that's where I receive my education on that, what truth is, and in helpful instructions on how to live that out. In Catholic, as a Catholic, I believe in both scripture and tradition that comes down through the church and people through the 2,000-year history of the church, who have thought much more deeply about a lot of these issues than I have, are much more learned than I have, know scripture better than I do. And I accept, there's a foundation that we're building upon. I think in the church, but in general, I think the arrogant idea that I think many people have today in society is that they can sort of, they don't have to take anything from anyone who came before them. They could figure out life and what it means by themselves, and they can, in the infamous words of which Supreme Court justice was that, about us creating our own reality, and that is very scary to me. We have to understand that we don't just come into this world with no one coming before us, who didn't create a lot of knowledge, and I also believe in revelation through the church. And from there, I use, Catholicism, being Catholic is about faith and reason. I'm also someone who questions everything, and I question it, but just because I question it, I try to work through things and understand them, and I don't immediately think if I have a question about something, it must be wrong. But God gave me a mind for a reason, and the reason is to reason. It is to think, and so I believe as a church has that. We also bring in the best thinkers, even though they are not Catholic or Christian. That certainly has been part of the development of what the church believes and teaches, because we believe that there is knowledge out there that people can come to. And I'm going in way too deep because I'm not a philosopher and I'm not steeped in philosophy, to say the least. Maybe like most of who's listening may be more deeply steeped in philosophy than I am. I know Margarita is. So I'm going to stop right there, and maybe we get back to things that I actually know more about.
Okay. All right. Well, let me tell you, I think you know more about this than you say you know, but I'll phrase the question in a way that maybe will help you elicit from your experience working as a member of Congress. What would you say? Here's what I would ask you. What would you say were some of the greatest, or are some of the greatest challenges that you have seen to our democratic way of government? Small d, not the Democratic Party, the small d democratic way of government. And I'm going to ask you to reflect on how you think those challenges might be shaped by culture and education and faith. That is, how did we get to some of the problems that I know you've written about the difficulties of working across party lines, about difficulties of identifying, the common good and self-sacrifice. So let me just start with this, because you're known as a problem solver. So the first thing I'll ask you to do is ask you to name some problems at the level of how our current system of government is functioning. What are the biggest problems you see, and what are some of the causes of that?
Well, the biggest problem our country has right now, and I am fearful for where this is going to take us, is our partisanship now is sectarian. A lot of people talk about, tribalism. I read an excellent short paper by, it was about a dozen social scientists in Science magazine, and they said that it's not tribalism, it's sectarianism. It fits all of, it checks all the boxes of what sectarianism is. It's the in-group and the out-group, and it's, people are, partisans are more held together by their hate of the other party. They believe people in the other party are evil. So there's no negotiating. There's no deliberation with people who are evil. And our government was set up in our Constitution to force deliberation and compromise. The decision was made not to have a parliament, but to have a presidential system, to have two chambers of Congress, to have powers shared between the chambers across the branches of government, and to have checks and balances. And the purpose was to try to force people to come together. And the idea of parties was not, in constructing this government, it was not thought that we were going to have political parties to begin with. The idea was representatives would come from across the country, either representatives in the House or senators, and they would voice the ideas, opinions, concerns, desires of the people they represent. And we, although people don't understand it today, the United States at its beginning was a very diverse country, relative to almost any other country, probably any other country in the world at that time. And people now think, well, we're so diverse now. We didn't have diversity back then. We were relatively diverse in the world at that time. So the founders understood that they wanted to bring all these ideas in and try to force representatives. It's a representative democracy. It's a republic. It's not a democracy. And I know everyone wants to say democracy, especially if you're a politician. It was not set up to be a direct democracy. But the idea was to have representatives bring these ideas together, talk about them, and try to come up with the best solutions for the country. Now we have two political parties with a very well-formed, each one has a very well-formed agenda, party platform. And if you want to be involved in politics, you have to choose one of these two parties. If you don't follow everything on the platform, as I experienced, I was going to say, as I found out, I knew it, but I experienced it. I was a pro-life Democrat, and that has become unacceptable to the elite that in the Democratic Party and who support the Democratic Party financially and through elections, that you can't be pro-life and be a Democrat. And so they spend a lot of money to get rid of me, the outside organizations. It really cuts down now on, you only have two, there aren't just two ways of thinking in this diverse country, but we're forced into that. Our government doesn't work. Our system does not work as it's set up with parties that operate in the way that they operate, with sectarian parties. It simply does not work. Congress is barely functional. Our federal government is barely functional right now. And that concerns me greatly. And for me as a representative, I'm too independent to sort of just say, okay, well, I'm going to sign up for whatever. And I've made the argument, I've told people that a trained monkey could do this job as a representative, because you just have to know, when you vote in the House, there's a voting machine. You have a voting card. You stick your card in the machine. There's 3 buttons that light up: green for yes, red for no, and yellow for present. You just have to, and your party leader will tell you which one of these buttons to press, and you do that. And you could be a good Democrat or a good Republican, and get by with that. And unfortunately, that's what happens. We're not thinking. Representatives aren't thinking, but I think a lot of people in the country no longer are thinking. They just feel like they need to choose one of these two parties. Why that is, I think it is fairly complicated. I know, Margarita, I mentioned you amusing ourselves to death. I think that is part of it. Have you read that already in the course?
Yeah.
The excerpt from that?
Yeah, so my class, getting to the root of the problem is what I'm hoping to do through the classes that I teach this summer with Pepperdine, but also through all of Scala's programs. And I think what I hear you describing is that the nature of our government really requires a voting populace as well as elected representatives who are capable of engaging in debate and seeing the good in the other side, and not doing what you're describing, which is devolving into a kind of sectarianism where somebody who disagrees with me must have evil intentions and be a bad person. So what we've been discussing in my class and a lot of the events that I do through Scala is what kind of an educational system should we have? Kind of what's the ideal of a liberal arts education? How do we form the virtues, the intellectual and moral virtues that allow us, the intellectual virtues like humility, thoroughness, maybe even a little bit of forbearance, like listening closely to the other side before reaching a judgment. And then also the moral virtues, knowing ourselves as human beings who need a guide towards how to use our gifts, and also needing boundaries, needing some kind of discipline to push back against the human the human fallenness, human tendencies to harm ourselves and to harm others. And I pair these kind of foundational thinkers, people that you mentioned, like Tocqueville, or reader or works I like Jacques Maritain, or John Dewey, who my class is reading this week, who argued about the importance of education for democracy. I pair them with pieces trying to understand what's not working in our educational system. So Neil Postman famously argued, for those of you who may not have read it, he argued in Amusing Ourselves to Death that a big threat to our common culture was, to put it simply, entertainment culture, the 24-hour news cycle, the kind of sound bite, and that instead of, thinking deliberative beings, our culture influenced by video and images was making it difficult for us to produce people who have the capacities to think slowly and look at different points of view and deliberate with people different than them. So you think that part of what's happening is really amusing ourselves to death. And so he ends this book raising a really important question that a lot of people thought the biggest threat to democracy was something called communism, right? Where a totalitarian state comes in and robs you of your freedom. And Neil Postman ends Amusing Ourselves to Death by saying, do we live in an Orwellian world of the big state? Or do we live in a Huxleyan world where we're so distracted all the time that we don't even formulate the coherent thoughts or have the language skills to even be able to engage in meaningful dialogue? And it sounds like you're saying we live in a Huxleyan world where we struggle to even have meaningful dialogue because we're distracted.
And what Postman wrote that in the 80s, right?
Yeah.
And so he hadn't seen anything like we have now. It's just gotten so much worse. I think that's a big problem. I think it's it is a Huxley world, but there's also a authoritarianism that arises in this, but it's not from directly from the government. It's you need to act one way or the other. You need to be. I keep going back because I did some political psychology to the whole in-group out-group dynamic. I mean, this is just perfectly that. And we have to think for ourselves. And that's what I keep getting back to. People are not thinking for themselves. And people who claim to be free thinkers are clearly are not. I think part of the problem is also as our lack of religious faith has dwindled. People are looking for meaning. It's a search for meaning, and they're looking for meaning in politics now. And so then, who are the two religions? And that's why it's become sectarian. The Democratic Party, Republican Party, they're giving you, this is what you're supposed to believe, and join us, and we will win. That's the other part. Join us in the struggle, be part of it, and that's what people are choosing over having a faith in God. And again, I often think about myself and think I'm a very I'm an Orthodox Catholic. But I also am very much someone who challenges myself all the time in thinking about what the church teaches. But the church doesn't, Catholic Church does not say not to do that. But it is, in more and more, I've spent more time trying to understand my faith. And it is in really diving into in trying to better understand the teachings of the church that I learn so much more. And I think I'm receiving, just from a purely faith angle in my religious faith, I'm receiving very much a liberal arts education in my faith, in that it's helping me to think through teachings that I find challenging and better understand them. And I think in general, this is what we all need to be doing with our lives in figuring out our lives and what we believe, in finding meaning, and understanding that we are not the first humans to be thinking this way. Again, I get back to that arrogance of people thinking, oh, I'm the first person to be feeling this or thinking this, and I'm going to try to understand the world without ever reading, hearing anyone else. And I accept that there are a lot of people who have come before me, many of whom were smarter than me, and we've built up through the years a lot of good things, that ideas, belief in philosophy. Knowing history makes a big difference, in knowing that having experience and understanding this isn't the first time that anyone has experienced something like this. That all is something that I know shapes me in what I'm thinking. And I believe, getting back to the question about, in a democracy, in a republic, the people, I think a lot of the representatives, many of them, I'm not sure how many of them, understanding what many of them would like to think for themselves. They feel constrained by what the parties have become, and the influence that these organizations, outside organizations, interest groups have on the parties, and are very constraining. I think in general, a lot of Americans just are not being educated in a way, and taught to really think critically. And certainly, the less and less we engage with people who think differently than us, the less educated we're going to be. And I think that's another part of it. And that's where social media comes in, and we don't get exposed to people who think differently than us. And I've always, as a more conservative Democrat, my own party has oftentimes challenged me, but that's good. Going back to high school, I was very much a free market person back in high school, and I had a religion class taught by, when we read a book, Following Christ in a Consumer Society, I think, which really was, I was very anti-communist at the time, and I read this and I thought, oh, this is just communist propaganda. But it was really talking about the common good, and what can we do to make our society better? How do we serve the common good, especially through economics? And it's something that stuck with me because it challenged me, and I was forced to deal with that myself. Today, we stay in our little bubbles and are not challenged at all. And I think that's the biggest problem that our society faces right now, and our country faces right now, is never being challenged and not wanting to be challenged. So we can't grow. We can't personally grow. And if we don't personally grow, and we can't work with others to develop better, getting back to politics and government, better, for example, policy solutions. There's very little attempt for members of Congress to really come up with, work together with people you don't necessarily agree with everything on to work towards good policy solutions. And that, again, was the whole purpose of setting the government up in the Constitution the way it was, to force people to do that. Now we have one party comes up with one, policy set of policies that they want to implement, and Democrats are getting more and more to the left, Republicans are getting more and more to the right, and I think most of the time the best policy for our country lies somewhere in the middle, but no one is even allowed to propose that right now. So I'll stop there and and see where you want to take this.
Well, I also want to know where the audience would like to go. We've got about 15 minutes left. I do have some follow-up questions, but let me just invite the audience to put their questions for Congressman Lipinski in the Q&A button. But so please go ahead and put your questions in there, and I will read them to the Honorable Dan Lipinski. Okay, but here's what I hear you saying, that on the one hand, you want to see cooperation, deliberation, learning from the other side. But earlier in your remarks, you began by talking about yourself as a Catholic. And as a Catholic, as a person of faith, that there is something already given to us, right? That we don't create society ex nihilo out of nothing. That creation is, well, this is my word, creation is a gift, but that also we have a past, we have a society, we have a set of institutions. From its founding, you pointed out that the United States of America was pluralistic. It welcomed people from different ethnic and religious backgrounds and invited them into a common life that transcended those differences without obliterating them. So that it was pluralistic, ethnically, culturally, religiously. And I would say that there was a sense that there was also a shared purpose, a common destiny, but that common political purpose or common purpose on earth was understood as being a part of a larger divine order, a larger created order. So I heard you saying two things, and I wonder if there's a relationship between them. That on the one hand, you've been talking a lot about critiquing sectarianism. And on the other hand, you've been saying that you're also concerned that people think that we have no boundaries, that we have no limits to what we can create or what we can do, that we have to have some sense of responsibility, not just to caring for others, but a responsibility to the creator of the world, right? And we're stewards. That's, again, this is my language, right? We're stewards of what's been given to us. And so it seems to me that part of what education should do is introduce people to the millennia of thinking about these questions of what is the nature of human person? What is creation? What kinds of knowledge are there? And how do we use knowledge to benefit our common humanity? And as I said to a group of engineering students one day, just like you wouldn't want someone who's never taken engineering to build your bridge, right? Don't you want an educational system that teaches you 2,000 years of thinking? Because you said a few times that you see, well, I'm the first one who's thought of this, right? I'm the first one who's come up with this idea about the nature of the human person. I'm like, well, actually, there's 2,000 or maybe more than that. There's thousands of years of thinking about ethical problems and human nature. And what I think sometimes the engineering majors I've tried to work with, what they confuse is an open-ended debate where one might end up disagreeing about the nature of the human person. They confuse that with there is no truth to these questions. And the only truth is how to build a bridge. And so then I say, well, but if there's no truth to any of these ethical positions, why are you right that we shouldn't be, I don't know, taking money from the poor or, putting elderly people to death? Like, what makes any of those ethical positions right if the only truth is a mechanical engineering truth? And it makes people uncomfortable because they want to think that their moral viewpoints are right. But a lot of people aren't used to being asked, challenged, well, what makes them right, right? Why are they right? So I guess I just want to say, that I hear you saying two things, that we need more cooperation and we need more listening to the other side, but we also need some kind of guidelines that come from tradition and that come from faith. So to people who might say specifically about faith, right? How has your faith influenced your politics? And how do you see the role of people of faith in a democracy where we respect pluralism around questions of faith?
Yeah, that's an easy question. First of all, I think my faith in, you had said this, and there, my faith tells me that I have a responsibility to my, I have a responsibility to my fellow human beings. I have a responsibility to God to be a steward of this world, and so that's a foundation, and that's something that I then go on from there and say, okay, what does that mean, and how do I do that? But if someone is just an adherent to scientism, that the only thing that's true is something that you can prove scientifically, or then, and therefore everything else is up for grabs. And where are you ultimately trying to go? How does it not just become a battle for power? And that seems to be sort of where we, in some ways, where we're going. But I disagree with progressives on many things, but I understand that they're looking for meaning. They have an idea about what is good, and they are striving to try to bring that good, in very much a, as anyone of any faith would do. How they come to what is good, is a question, and there doesn't seem to be any dialogue at all on either side. I'm not just saying progressives, but dialogue that would challenge that, that view. And it doesn't seem like the right one, it really wants a dialogue with the left, or left wants a dialogue with the right. They just, have their idea, and they say this is right and true, and this is what needs to be done, and I'm going to do whatever it takes. Again, that's another part. We're tearing down our institutions, because both sides think whatever it takes to get what I want done is good. And without the institutions, I need to get this down better than I'll say it right now, because this often comes to mind in A Man for All Seasons. So Thomas More, his son-in-law challenges him on someone who's coming after Thomas More, and Thomas More says, I would give the devil the benefit of the law. And his son-in-law challenges him, you would give the devil the benefit of the law? And he says, yes, because if I didn't, what happens when I tear down every law to go after the devil, and the devil turns on me, and there's nothing left to protect me? It's that pursuit of what I believe is right, without having any constraint whatsoever, without understanding, getting back to the context of the government, of needing to be constrained by that, because without that, without the institutions, if we tear down every institution to get what we want, we are left with utter chaos. And I think that's something that is concerning me greatly right now, and it's something that we certainly saw from President Trump, and we saw that from some Democrats who went after President Trump. Said, well, he's evil, so we don't need to follow the rules. We just need to get rid of him. And we need the institutions. Again, this is something that things have been developed before us, and it's not that institutions don't have to be reformed, but you can't just tear them down and expect that everything's just going to go on smoothly, that our country is going to continue if you tear down the institutions. Again, yes, they need reform, and I don't want anyone to think I'm saying we can't change them. We've reformed our institutions continuously, but you have to consider, you don't just do it. You don't just tear something down to get what you want now. You have to consider the future, and that's something else that I think we don't consider so much is posterity. We want what we want right now, and we don't consider what the long-term, maybe even the medium-term consequences are going to be. And again, that involves if you have no understanding of history, I think it's very easy to do that. And so.
Well, all right. So I think some of the questions that are coming in from the audience are a little bit along the lines of, where do we go from here? What advice do you give to young people? What's the future of our political system? So you've talked a lot about the problems, tearing down each other, tearing down our institutions, partisanship. So I guess these two questions are, maybe I'm going to connect them a little bit, but I have young people in my class who are interested in running for office. What advice would you give them? And is part of that advice that we need a third party? Is it viable to think of there being a three-party system? So those are two questions I'm putting into one. What advice do you give people running for office? And do we need more than two parties?
The way our system is set up, it's very difficult to have more than one party. Historically, we have had
more than two parties.
More than two parties, sorry. So historically, as I was saying, we've had two parties, and they've reformed. When the parties no longer really were representing one party or the other, both parties were not really representing people well, they changed. We've had different party systems, and so that comes out of political scientists have written about this. How do we have realignments, and people switch parties. The parties change some of what they believe, and people move between parties. Perhaps that's happening now. There certainly seems to be. When we were at Napa, and I'm working on writing something about this, we have Republicans now that sound like Democrats from 40, 50 years ago, and especially when it comes to economics. They could have been a Democrat 40, 50 years ago with some of the things that some of these Republicans are now saying. Is this a real change? We'll see if they really follow through. The problem is our parties are so, it's hard to change them. Partly because of the interest groups. They are so much dependent on certain interest groups to support them. These interest groups aren't going to change. That's the thing, and that's what constrains politicians so much, is the interest groups who give the money, who just send these ideas out there. They create the narrative. They have so much power. Yeah. I'd love there to be a third party right now, just to try to break this. I'm not sure how we're going to break this sectarian partisanship. It's just very hard to do. Now, I always want to encourage young people. It's so tough right now, but if no one's going to work to try to change this, and if good people don't get into politics, then it's only people who have self-interest that are going to get into politics. And if people with new ideas don't get into politics, or different ways of thinking don't get into politics, we're just going to be, things are never going to change. So it's a tough road. The money supports the two parties as they are. That makes it difficult, but we've got to make a change. And it's easier to look, even though all politics has become national, it's easier to change things locally. It's easier to get in locally. still, without being, a Democrat or Republican who follows the party line 100%, and that's probably the place to start, and build up from there.
Great. Well, again, let me tie together a couple of things you said with another question. It sounds like you're saying that it's difficult to break the two-party system, but you do want to encourage people nonetheless to run for office. And maybe they need to find some of the factions within the parties maybe realigning, and maybe there's some of that realignment that new people wanting to run for office can find. But it also sounds like from your biography and what I've read about you that you think it is possible to be a moderate who seeks to compromise, and yet you've also stood clearly on certain principles. So you've made it clear what you're going to compromise on and what you're not willing to compromise on. And the pro-life issue was not an issue you were willing to compromise on, even to keep your seat in Congress. So I hear you saying that we need people who are moderates, and people who are moderates should try to take the risk to run for office, being sanguine about the challenges. But nonetheless, if we give up on trying, then how would we ever change the system? And specifically, one listener wants to know whether or not you think there's room for pro-life Democrats in the party. I mean, there used to be a coalition of pro-life Democrats or Democrats for life. So does it matter that there's no longer that kind of a coalition, or that the Democratic Party doesn't really allow its candidates, at least at the national level, to be pro-life? Is politics just not the way now to address the question around the origins and protection of human life?
There are still 25 to 30% of Democratic voters in this country who call themselves pro-life. And they are just not represented in the Democratic Party because all the money, and I know the abortion group spent $3 million against me, at least $3 million in 2018. I narrowly won, and they spend as much again in 2020, where I narrowly lost. And so that's the very tough part about it. I run into a number, especially young people, who say they are generally find themselves aligned with the Democratic Party, but they're pro-life, and they are very troubled by this. And I fear that people stick with they decide they have to buy into 100% of one party, 100% of the other party. And I just encourage people to not do that, to dare to be different, think for themselves, and don't give that up. I think it's still possible. That I think at some point, I'm hopeful the Democratic Party wakes up and understands that they could be more successful electorally if they just provide room for pro-life Democrats. And you just said, Margarita, and it's been written in this way that I won't compromise on abortion. I characterize it like this: I would not give up on being pro-life, but it's not that I would say, well, I'm not going to vote for anything unless it bans abortion. Things like the Hyde Amendment, that prevents, it's controversy this week. It's the first time in 40 something years it's not an appropriations bill. The bill is coming out of the House that bans taxpayer funding for abortion in Medicaid, except for the cases of rape, incest in the life of the mother. So there are exceptions there. And I always supported the Hyde Amendment, and it wasn't as if I was going to say, well, that's not enough, so I'm not going to vote for something that has that, because it's not. So I compromise on the abortion issue and things that get us closer. I think protect more innocent life. I compromise there. I just wasn't going to give it up because I think it's so important, and that's the way I look at it. Because I'm willing to talk to anyone And I think compromise is essential, but I wasn't going to give up something that I fundamentally believe that, that is a life. I believe life, I believe it's not just my Catholic faith, but science shows us that life begins at conception. And so I believe it deserves protection, and I was going to stay with that. But again, if I could protect one more individual, I would do that, and I would accept compromise legislation in some way to do that.
Well, thank you. And I guess maybe, we're winding down now. So I guess maybe this might be more of a personal reflection, but a student wants to know, you said that we grow by being challenged, and you were challenged electorally and defeated your opponents, for several times, but then you lost most recently. And the student wants to know, what do you think you learned by losing to a more progressive Democrat in your last election? What have you learned? And do you think that you grew from being challenged in that way?
Yeah, I saw that question. It's very interesting in terms of how I grew. I mean, I knew who I was in how I was going to present myself. I mean, that's another part of it. A lot of it really, it tugged me to be more emotional in my presentation of my positions. I was 2 years ago, right around this time, 2 years ago, I was in Gilroy, California, at the Garlic Festival when there was a shooter came in. It was a mass shooting. I'm not sure how many people died. 7 or 8 people were killed. I was there. I heard it. I ran for my life. I was scared. And they didn't know. I mean, it was a couple hours before they, knew that there's only one person and that they had stopped this person. But, I heard those shots, and it was very surreal. I went through that experience, and someone wrote that, Lipinski should be doing more to use that experience in order to help him politically. And I thought, well, I have an F. I've always had an F rating from the NRA. I always voted that way. But I was never going to tell people, well, first of all, I wasn't going to pull on people's heartstrings and say, feel sorry for me because I was in the situation. I mean, it did bring it home to me, but I already felt that this was a big problem, that something should be done about. I voted that way, but I also wasn't going to tell people that this is going to solve, that any kind of law is going to solve the problem either. And so I just would, part of it was presentation and I wasn't, there's nothing that I was going to change in my positions. Climate change, I was there on climate change a long time ago, but I thought the Green New Deal was just, it was nonsensical. It was not real legislation, but I wasn't going to embrace that because it was not really going to do anything. It wasn't going anywhere. It's not going to do anything. And so all those things sort of were more of, I wasn't going to change. And I don't, in many ways, my position on abortion, hurt me a lot, but I wasn't going to change what I believe, who I am, and what I was going to support in order to win. And I understand, as I said earlier, I don't, and I've never characterized progressives, even at things that I think I completely disagree with. I think there's a reason that people believe these things and want to instill certain policies. I don't agree with, but I've never, personally attacked people. Again, I think we need to have we need to discuss these things.
Right.
So I would not have, in a sense, I'd say, and I hate to say I didn't learn anything, but I went through all this. I already thought through all these things, and I wasn't going to change. And I would not have changed anything that I did, any position that I took. I am who I am. It was going to represent my constituents in that way. And so it's not something that I'm going to, again, I wasn't going to change just to stay in office. And, through the years, I changed my position on some things. Immigration reform, I opposed it early on. After what I saw and experienced and saw how Congress works and nothing was getting done and what was going on, with any lack of progress whatsoever and anything changing in this country, I came to support comprehensive immigration reform. So over my career, I did change my position on some issues in terms of an ultimate goal. And one of the things that I did in Congress that I was most enjoyable, at least for a while, was when I sat down, quietly, without any publicity whatsoever, a group of Democrats and Republicans sat down to try to work out something. When President Trump said he was going to get rid of DACA for the those who came to this country illegally as children, who were protected under executive order under President Obama, that he was going to get rid of that. A group of us said, let's come up with a compromise. And we sat down and we were very serious about talking through an issue that you almost never see Democrats and Republicans talking about, seriously considering and trying to compromise and come to solutions on. And we did that. And we came up with something, but we couldn't bring it to the House floor because the rules prevented it, and no speaker was going to allow a bipartisan group to come up with a solution to bring a bill to the floor. That wasn't what the speaker wanted, because at that time it was Speaker Ryan. Even though he was for comprehensive immigration reform, he knew it would hurt him with his party. So there are things that I changed my views on during my time in Congress. And again, this was through experience and through reason that I came to these. And I think we still need to have representatives. We need to have a society where people are talking to each other and learning from each other. And that's truly the way that we move forward as a country. That's how we have better policy for the country. We also need to regain the sense of sacrifice and the need for sacrifice. I think that is a big problem that we have completely lost, is no one considers that sacrifice is necessary. And so all those things. So I will stop. I'll get off my soapbox here. And hopefully this was helpful to everyone here. I always say I'm an engineer. So as I listen to Margarita, I listen to you talking about in sort of putting what I said into much more in a much more concise and direct way. I appreciate that, but I still have an engineer's vocabulary, and so hopefully hopefully everyone got what I was saying, and hopefully it was helpful in understanding education. And look, I was this way even when I was still in politics. Is most politicians won't ever admit they don't know anything, and I admit that I don't know things, and I struggle with things, and I work through things, and I'm willing to work through these things in public, talking to you, and hopefully that's helpful to hopefully that's helpful to all of you.
I'm extremely grateful for your time and for sharing your personal experiences and your insights. And what you said did come across to me very clearly. You said many times we need to think for ourselves. We need to understand and respect tradition. We need to acknowledge that we have a creator, God. We need to listen to and work with people who are different than us. We need to find compromises where we don't give up on our principles, yet find a working solution to avoid getting entrenched in a us versus them sectarian partisanship, which you said, I think very clearly, ultimately leads to chaos, which is what you fear is happening. And I've heard you say that sacrifice is important and that we grow from our struggles and from our losses. And I know that as a person who has served our country in the United States House of Representatives, you have sacrificed a lot and you have learned from your mistakes. You've even changed your position on a few things. I think politicians don't like to admit they're wrong, and they don't like to admit that they've ever changed their minds on something. And I thank you for taking the time tonight to just share honestly your reflections on your years of service and your views about why you served the nation as you did. And now in your career post being a member of Congress, I hope that there'll be a lot more occasions for people to hear from you. And I'm sure you will continue to grow and that audiences will absolutely grow from listening to you. Again, Scala's mission is to try to revitalize culture through promoting liberal arts education, understanding that human beings are made for meaning and purpose, and that education has to shape the next generation to know the traditions that we've inherited, to be able to change them as needed, but from a starting point and from thinking about what might we need to preserve, and always helping young people find their meaning and purpose. And from that, what is their calling to serve the common good? So thank you. You exemplify so many of the virtues that I hope our educational systems and Scala's programs produce. So now, okay, we're done the official program. I'm going to invite the students from my class to join us in our classroom at so 8:15 Eastern, that's 5:15 for those of you in Pacific time. Dr. Lipinski, thank you so much. Audience, thank you so much. It was great hearing from you, and I hope to hear more from you in the newspapers and future talks.
Thank you.